All right. Well, I think with that, we're good to get started.
All right, I will be in the background.
All right. Thank you. Well, welcome everyone to this session on SQL views and generic inquiries. My name is Tim Rodman, and the goal in this session is to show you three main examples with SQL views and generic inquiries. But I do want to spend an uncomfortable amount of time talking about the what and the why behind SQL views and generic inquiries. Then a smaller portion of time talking about the how of how to do this. And my thought on this is that I look at a 30-minute presentation as being not that long to get into the how. And if you look at I just blanked on what they're called, a TED Talk. If you look at a TED Talk, I believe that initially their limit was 18 minutes, although I've seen some lately that are in the 20 to 30-minute range. Now, this does not rise to the level of a TED Talk at all. This is not even a rehearsed presentation. I wish I had more time to do that. But the point is that I think a 30-minute session is good for talking about ideas and the what, the why, focusing on that. But then for those of you like Arlene in the chat who are really disappointed right now about the how, of course, we want the how to do stuff in Acumatica. So I did spend a good amount of time this past week writing a blog post that is over 4,000 words with a lot of screenshots, and it goes into the details of the how for the three examples that I'm going to talk about. So the goal in this session is to focus on the ideas, the what, the why, but don't worry, you will have a 4,000 plus word blog post at the end that you can take with you. You can actually see it on the screen here, the very top of it, but don't go there yet because it won't go live until like 5 minutes before the end of this session. So you won't see it there until the very end. But you can take that with you and kind of go through it step by step. I realized there was more stuff than I had time for, so that's why I did it in a blog post. And for those of you who don't write blog posts, typically a blog post is around maybe 500 or 600 words. And, this one's 4,000, so it's pretty substantial. So that's it. So I will be going through, I'm just going to scroll through basically and highlight some things in the post. And then I will show some light demo on my screen, just kind of introduce some things. But I'll start off with just my personal background and why I personally am into SQL these days. And I think that helps a lot to explain the why. All right, so I grew up in San Diego, California. A lot of people think of the beach when they think of San Diego. I like the mountains better. You can see they're pretty close together. So I like this picture of downtown San Diego with Cuyamaca Peak in the background, snow-covered, El Capitan on the left. That's where I grew up. I then went to UCLA for college, where I majored in applied math, minored in accounting, and computer programming, which I didn't know at the time, but set me up pretty good, I think, for ERP systems. I then went to downtown Los Angeles to work out of this building for Deloitte doing financial auditing. And I think it's there that I first got interested in reporting, because time after time, we would ask for information from the client, and just basic requests, they really struggled to get that information. And just helped me to realize, yeah, there's great tools out there for reporting, but practically in the real world, people are still spending a lot of time cobbling data together manually. I kind of accidentally fell into the world of mid-market ERP after my time at Deloitte, and I was working with a Sage product, which at the time was called Mass 500. But like every Sage product, it's had several name changes. I think it's still called Sage 500, and it's a client server Windows application. And there's a screenshot of it right there. Then I changed gears in around 2013, so about 10 years now. I got off the Sage wagon and jumped on the acuMatica wagon, and no regrets at all. Definitely a much more fun product to work with, and been working with it for about 10 years now. And in that time, I've worked for acuMatica on their implementation assist team. I also worked for 2 different value-added resellers, but for about the last 3 years, I have been focused. I've just been doing independent consulting, focused on reporting in acuMatica. So that includes, I guess one more slide here. You see I've done some presentations at the acuMatica Summit. I think this one was in Houston. And thank you, acuCONNECT, for letting me do a presentation here. I will say I was very happy that you get to pick the session title for, at least when I did some presentations at acuMatica Summit, you get handed a session title, and it's some marketing made title. So I was glad I got to have a simple title of SQL views and generic inquiries. So these days I'm focused on reporting in acuMatica, and that includes generic inquiries, that includes dashboards, pivot tables, also not on this slide, but printable reports with Report Designer, the financial report writer, both inside of acuMatica and outside using a tool called Velixo. I've also do quite a bit when you need a business intelligence solution with Microsoft Excel and Power BI. So different tools, but basically the end goal is delivering information to people so they can make decisions. And a lot of times it's a challenge to know which tool to use, especially if you're not familiar with the tools, but that's all the area that I focus in. And so more and more these days, I've found that, hey, there's this thing called SQL from a long time ago that I used to do SQL programming for several years. And it does a great job of getting me the information that I need. So if you come down here, this is my pitch for why I think SQL matters. If you're interested to see where I came up with these numbers, you can check out my webinar at augforums.com/augSQL. And let me see if I can zoom in on this a little bit. So my estimate for the number of Excel users worldwide is here, 46. Oh, wait a second. That doesn't look right. Oh, no, that's right. I was coming up with a number for not just users of Excel, but people who know how to build Excel. The users number is a lot bigger than this, but let's say Microsoft developers, I'll put it at around 47 million. Then if you go down one step further to the number of people who know how to do SQL, actually create SQL, I put that at about 9.4 million. And then if you go look at the number of people who know how to do development in acuMatica, I'm guessing the number is around 1,000. And that might be kind of gracious, but feel free to chime in the chat. It's the number I'm most skeptical of. But the point is that, hey, with Excel, why is Excel such a popular tool? It's because there are so many people out there who know how to build things in Excel. They have those skills, right? And I like Excel a lot. The problem with Excel is that it's outside of acuMatica. Now, I'm not a fan of Excel as a database, like a place to store info, but I think it's a great tool for reporting. And I think that's why the most popular acuMatica ISV product out there is Velixo. It's not necessarily the Velixo functionality. It's the fact that their functionality is in Excel, so I can use all my Excel skills. And I think you can apply similar reasoning to SQL. I think there's a lot of things that people want to do, that they don't do because it requires an acuMatica developer. And as you can see from the chart, the number of people out there who know how to do those things is very limited. But I think the population of people who know SQL is much larger than the acuMatica developer population. So if you haven't already, check out the poll in this session and add your vote there. I'm actually curious to see where we're at there. Just got a few votes. I'm curious to see, everyone attending this session, what level of experience you have with SQL. Now, also my point on this slide is you may not have SQL skills, right? But if you're looking to do some, I'm focused on reporting here, some more advanced reporting without leaving acuMatica, you have a much larger population of people to tap into if you're using SQL, as opposed to having to go to an acuMatica developer. So I think that Velixo matters because Excel matters, and there's a product I'm actually going to show you here called acuSQL that I think matters because SQL matters. All right, so enough of the intro there. You'll see this, I'm just scrolling through the blog post. And there's 3 examples, and we'll spend most of the remaining of our time here on the first example. Then I want to also make sure, though, that I hit 3 and 4. And actually, you know what? We are going to skip the first example and go right to number 2. If you want to see how to do this with native acuMatica, look at this first example here. Scroll through. You'll see it's just a lot more steps because you have to use a customization project to deploy your SQL code and to create the data access class. So I'm going to skip this step and go right to the second step. I'm going to use my new acuSQL product that I partnered with a developer on to create, to skip the SQL part of the customization project and just go right to using the customization project for a data access class. And the way things work in acuMatica is you need a data access class in order to do reporting, no matter what, like a report designer report, generic inquiry, dashboard, whatever. It can only see data access classes. So when you're working with SQL views, your first step is to create the SQL view. Then you put the data access class on top of that. And that's what makes the SQL view visible to the rest of acuMatica. Now, this example that I'm going to use here, I think is a pretty simple example. But I ran into this at a client, actually 2 different clients, for 2 different reasons. And one of the clients, they wanted to know when their VAR was publishing customization projects, because sometimes it would break things. And they just wanted to know who's doing it and when, just so we know what's going on. Another client was experiencing acuMatica restarting at random times. And to help them troubleshoot that, they wanted to know when acuMatica was restarting. Now that information, both of those pieces of information, is stored in the database in this table right here called system event. But it's not available as a data access class by default, at least not that I've seen. Feel free to chime in the chat. If you do, you ruin my whole example. So I still will learn something. So let's go over here to acuMatica. And again, I'm going to show you this with my acuSQL product. Take a look at the blog post, though, for the longer way of being able to do this same thing. You don't have to have acuSQL to do this. But I'm going to use this just because it's easier, faster. Let me see if I can get my copy paste to work. Yeah, you know what? Let's just start with this. Let's just grab the top 10 records from the system event table. Click execute here. And we'll see acuSQL runs exactly the SQL query that we put. It returns the results in a grid down here. And just like with a generic inquiry, we can filter on a column, sort on a column, hide columns. It gives us the ability to query that information. I'm also showing this example because I've been using this more and more at clients, and I just find practically it's so much faster to be able to work with your live production data when you're building a SQL view, rather than a development environment, which is going to have an older copy of your data, because now I know exactly what things look like right now. And that has an impact on the report that I'll eventually deliver, right? So let's see here. Yeah, so you can see all the columns available here. And I think the reason why this one is not available by default, I think, actually I was thinking it didn't have a tenant. Yeah, I think because not everything is tenant specific. You know, like a system restart is not really tenant specific. And typically you'd find a company ID column in a table to specify what tenant a record belongs to. So I think that's why it's not available by default. But you can see here that using this code, actually we don't even need the first two lines. Let's just use these two lines. It's real simple to create a SQL view. And I'm hard coding in this case the tenant, because when you work with SQL views in Acumatica, you have to have a company ID column. When we build the data access class on top of it, the data access class is going to hide the company ID column, but it's going to use company ID so it knows which tenant to pull the data from. And why isn't it called tenant ID? Well, that's because these used to be called companies until Acumatica came up with a better name, which is tenants, much better name. And I think they just didn't want to go back into the database and change all the field names to tenant ID. But in the database, basically company ID is tenant ID. And you have to have that column so Acumatica can restrict the data that it returns depending on the tenant that you're logged into. But I need to trick it in this case because there is no tenant ID column or company ID. So I'm just hard coding in number 2, which is sales demo, the tenant that I'm logged into. And actually, that's probably a good example to look at. Let's look at the, I can't remember if it's company or company. Yeah, company. So you can see I'm in sales demo. That is company ID number 2. You can see that in the table. All right, so let's go back here and we're going to create a SQL view. There's our name. I'll go ahead and click execute. And because I already did this, it's already in there. That is why you'll see in here that there's a drop. If you're going to do the customization project way, make sure you have this, because if it ever tries to publish that customization project a second time, it's going to give you an error. And actually, I forgot, I can't do that in acu-SQL. It won't let me run 2 statements at a time. So if I wanted to drop it, I would run a drop statement like this. Actually, let's go ahead and do that. I would run the drop statement. Step 1. And now I can run my create statement. All right, so we took care of getting the SQL view into the database, but we can't report on it yet until we create the data access class. So let's come further down here. You can see this is the way we would have done that if we were doing a customization project. When you publish customization projects, you're supposed to only do them in the evening, although sometimes you can get away with it during the day, but I would do it in the evening when no one's logged in. This goes through how to do all of that. But I'm going to scroll down to this part right here. All right, so let's create a customization project. Open this in a new tab. And I usually like, for a particular environment, I like having one customization project that has all my SQL views in it. And you can see I've already built that here, my SQL views. But for the sake of this example here, let me delete this and recreate it just so you can see how easy this is. Save that. You want to, oh, sorry, I should go a little slower here. All right, you want to click on the left-hand side, you want to go to code. This is all in the blog post. Then you want to click the plus sign and you want to choose new DAC. That stands for data access class. Then you want to give it a name, and I already forgot my name, my SQL system event. So I realized after I wrote this, MySQL is a terrible name because it actually means a different database engine than I'm using here. I would use something else, like, 3 letters that represent your company. Something I would begin them all with the same thing, whatever you choose, or maybe it's just my. But that way, everything will sort together, the views that you create. So you give it a name, start it with the same something every time you create a new view, and then check this box here, generate members from the database. Now, this does have to match the name of the SQL view that we already created. So if you were to change the name, you'd need to change this as well in the view. And the reason is when you check the generate members from database box, it goes out and looks for a SQL view with this exact name. So we check that and we click OK. So even though this is a bunch of scary C# code, at least it's scary for me. If you scroll through here, lots of scary C# code. The nice thing is it generated it for me, right? I didn't have to know that the first line needs to say using system. I have no idea that it would require that. But I still can make some changes to this. And the first rule that I like to follow is that, actually, I'll show you. I have my 2 rules listed here somewhere. Here. Let's see. Oh, further down. Okay, so I'll follow the blog post sequence. The first thing we need to do is we do need to give it a primary key. And the main thing I've seen get messed up is report designer if you don't do this, but you need to do this. You can see, right, I highlighted in red the little piece that I added. So it generated this PBX DB identity, and all we need to do is add in a little piece, put parentheses, then is key equals true. And I'll save that. So we need a key, primary key, and it could be multiple columns that you would add is key to. And then I like to follow these 2 rules. I like to make the first few occurrences match exactly. So ID is the first occurrence, ID is the second occurrence, and then the last 2 on this last line right here and right here. For some reason, C# requires that it begins with a lowercase letter. So I just do exactly what's up here, but with a lowercase first letter. I don't know why that's the rule, but that's the rule. So by doing that, I get rid of spaces. Like you see, for some reason, it put the space here. I just want this to match this, to match this. And then these match exactly the same, except the first letter is lowercase. I think we got everything else. Looks fine. Oh, I'll remove the space from event ID and screen ID, user, properties. That all looks good. All right, so then the other thing I do here is I wanted the date and time to be displayed, not just the date. So I added this. I replaced the date. Where's my date? Here's my date. Replace this with this. And I probably need to replace that. So maybe a little scary because I have to do some changes, but hopefully not too bad. I think this is the hardest part. If you know SQL, have some familiarity, create the SQL view. You can do a lot with SQL. Then you create the data access class on top. Then we publish this. And you know what? I think for the sake of time, I've already published this. So I'm going to skip right to where I used it. I'm not going to go through the publish. You can look at the blog post for that. But I created a dashboard called System Events. And I did 2 different widgets. One of them filters on one type of event. The other one filters on the other type. And so this very simple dashboard here satisfied the needs of both clients. One client can see when customization projects were published and who published them. And the other client can see when the site restarted. Now, of course, I logged in today right at the beginning of this session or 26 minutes before. You can see there it is right there listed. So pretty cool. Simple SQL view, simple example. You can get a lot more complicated with SQL, but hopefully this gets you started with how to hook something up. Now, in our remaining few minutes, I'll just mention the other two examples that I have in this blog post. So first off, you'll see there's all my data access code in case you want to go through it. Lots of details, over 4,000 words in this post. Plenty of info to take a look at. But let's see there, build the dashboard. That shows you how to do that. And then if we get down here, oh, that's how to do it with acuSQL. Let's jump to this one. So another thing I've noticed since I started using acuSQL is I had one client that was pulling data into Power BI using a Power BI data flow. And I think data flows are the way to go with Power BI. It's sort of like a data warehouse within Power BI, and then you build your Power BI reports and data sets on top of that. But pulling the data out of Acumatica can get pretty slow because OData is very slow. Now, if that's happening to you, I know Johnny Girardi chimed in on here. Definitely take a look at the DataSelf ETL Plus product because they can do a differential refresh and only pull in the data that has changed since the last time you refreshed. But for this particular client, I was curious to see what would happen if instead of pulling a regular generic inquiry where I'm combining the tables together in the generic inquiry, what if I do the same exact logic, but I do it in SQL? And then I build a generic inquiry with my SQL data access class. Would OData refresh faster? Now, normally I probably wouldn't have done this because it's a pain to create the SQL view, but because of acuSQL, it was much faster to do it. So I did it. There's the SQL code I used. I connected it to a generic inquiry using my essentially one table at this point. And then if you come down here, this is a screenshot out of Power BI data flows area. And you can see it was failing. It was taking over 13 minutes to refresh. I think this particular one had 900 and something thousand records in it. Yeah, 940,000 records, invoice lines in the table. But if you come down here, you'll see that was taking 13 minutes to refresh, and it was failing because it was taking so long. But by using the SQL view, it took it down to 3 minutes, and now it's refreshing fine. So I thought that was an interesting thing to learn, that SQL views speed up OData quite a bit. And so we're just refreshing out the SQL view for now. And then I have one last example. I even shared all the SQL code in here for it. This post ends with a big giant stored procedure. But for another client that I'm using acuSQL at, they needed a replenishment solution that was customized to their business. And if you've used the Acumatica replenishment, you really don't have much flexibility in terms of how it runs replenishment. So I just built something in a SQL stored procedure. I've shared the code on the bottom of this blog post if you're interested. And then that goes out and grabs the sales orders, the invoices to get your demand, the purchase orders. It grabs the quantity on hand of the inventory, makes all that data available, and then we're reporting on it in a generic inquiry. And then we use a business event to allow them to check off the lines that they want to buy and just click the trigger by action type of a business event to create the purchase orders. But the key is that you need the SQL code to run, right? And so we're using acuSQL, and I point out here that you can even run the SP help text command to see the definition of the stored procedure that's in there currently in the database. I usually save my code though off in a text file somewhere. And then the only command you need to run replenishment is this execute statement. And so we actually have a way in acuSQL where you can schedule a SQL command to run on some type of schedule. So this has been scheduled at this client. It runs every morning automatically. So then they come in and their replenishment is basically already run for them, and they use the generic inquiry to decide what they're going to buy. All right, so I think I am at the top of the hour here. there's the link to the blog post. You can also just go to augforums.com and go to free blog up on the top. It should be the top post. Actually, let me make sure it's out there. Let me make sure it posted up here, free blog. Should have posted about 5 minutes ago. And yep, there it is, right at the top there, or just go straight to it with this link here, and you've got a lot of documentation on the how. But hopefully in this session, I've given you some ideas for how to use SQL in Acumatica, and especially from a reporting angle. I've been finding myself doing this more and more. I think it works great.
Thanks, Tim. A lot of great comments in the chat. And if you didn't take the poll yet, take the poll. You have 10 votes for some experience, but not much. That's the highest one. 7, I'm pretty comfortable. 5, SQL, what's SQL? And 6, I love SQL so much that I want to marry.
Yeah, so we've got a little bit over 20 there, right? And we've got 49 people in the session. So please vote on that poll. I'm curious to see among all you attendees what your level of experience is with SQL.
I'm just seeing if there's any questions in the chat, but I don't see any.
Yeah, I don't see any in the Q&A. Don't see any in the chat. Some discussion about how to pronounce SQL, SQL versus SQL. Oh yeah, thanks Steve for dropping the link to the post in the chat. All right, well, with that, I think there's a little break probably till the next session, right? I'll let you all go.
2 minutes.
And
so thank you again, Tim, for presenting. This was awesome.
Absolutely.
Not that I know anything about SQL, but hey. I was
SQL,
one of the ones.
Right? We don't know.
I was one of the first ones. I voted the first one.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your time. See ya.
Bye.